In the years since Cole's body had been lowered into the frozen ground without rites, she understood she had learned to notice signs the land offered without asking. Feathers like that one carried weight. In some stories she had overheard at the trading post long ago stories of restless spirits that followed the living until the wrong was set right. She had never believed them. Not fully. But belief was not required for the weight to settle in her chest. Rory glanced once more at the ridge. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, the sun already bleeding behind the rim rock. She dragged the last armload of split wood toward the cabin door, boots crunching the silence. Inside the fire, she had banked that morning still smoldered, throwing faint orange light across the rough log walls. She dropped the wood beside the hearth, knelt and fed the coals until flames licked upward again. The familiar smell of pine resin and smoke steadied her hands. She told herself the track could belong to anyone, a stray prospector, a lost trapper. The canyon drew men the way a dying fire draws moths briefly hungrily, then gone. Yet the thought felt thin like smoke pushed through a crack. Outside, the first flakes began again, soft and steady, erasing the world one layer at a time. She was pouring coffee into a tin cup when the hoofbeats came. They were not the reckless clatter of men in a hurry. They were slow, measured the sound of animals walking on the edge of collapse. Rory set the pot down without a sound. She crossed to the window, edged the shutter open an inch, and looked out. 2 riders crested the low saddle of the ridge outlined against the failing light. Their horses moved with heads, low legs trembling under frost-rimed blankets. The men sat straight despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of their shoulders. Fur cloaks, deer-hide leggings, hair long and tied back. Apache. Rory's fingers tightened on the rifle stock that rested against the wall. She had heard the stories, raids, ambushes men shot from cover and left for the coyotes. She had also heard other stories, quieter ones, of families driven from springs, of villages burned while the soldiers watched. She did not know which story these 2 carried. The older man raised a hand, palm open, no weapon drawn. The younger one scanned the cabin, the barn, the fence-line eyes never still. They stopped 30 yards out. The wind carried their voices in fragments. Storm closing, horses spent. Rory remained at the window. The coffee cooled on the table behind her. She felt the old reflex rise, bar the door, wait them out, let the cold do what it would. But the horses were swaying now, ribs sharp under wet hide. One of them coughed a wet, hollow sound that carried across the snow. She drew a long breath, tasting wood smoke and iron on her tongue. She opened the door. The cold rushed in like a hand against her face. She stepped onto the porch rifle held loose along her thigh, not pointed, not yet. "You're a long way from anywhere," she said. The older man nodded once. His voice came low, careful, as though each word cost something. "We ask only shelter. One night. For the horses, for us." The younger man said nothing. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, thumb hooked over the sheath. Rory looked from one to the other, then at the sky. Snow thickened, slanting sideways now. The canyon walls were already blurring white. She stepped aside. "Bring them to the barn. There's straw. Water in the trough if it ain't froze solid." They dismounted without haste. The horses staggered forward at the smell of shelter. Rory watched the men lead them past, noting the way the older one laid a steadying hand on the neck of the nearer animal, murmuring something she could not hear. When they returned from the barn, stamping snow from their boots, she pointed to the table. "Sit. Stew's hot." They hesitated. The younger man's eyes flicked to the rifle above the hearth, then to her face. The older one dipped his head. "Thank you." They sat. Rory served 2 bowls, then took her own place across from them back to the wall rifle within reach under the table edge. The fire popped. Steam arose from the bowls. No one spoke. Outside, the storm settled in for the night. Inside, the silence grew thicker than the snow piling against the shutters. Rory lifted her spoon, let it hover. She felt the weight of their presence like a stone in the room, 2 men carrying their own ghosts, 2 men who had crossed a line they might never cross back. She met the older man's eyes across the firelight. He did not look away. And in that moment, she understood the land had not forgotten Cole Reed. It had simply waited for someone else to remember with her. The storm had sealed the canyon like a grave. Rory closed the door behind the 2 men, the latch dropping with a dull iron clack that sounded louder than it should. Snow sifted through the cracks around the frame, dusting the puncheon floor in fine white lines. She barred the door without hurry, then turned. The older one, Tate, stood near the hearth, hands loose at his sides, snow melting off his moccasins in dark spots. The younger one, Rafe, remained closer to the entrance, back against the wall, fingers resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Neither removed their cloaks. The room smelled of wet wool horse sweat and the faint metallic edge of frost-bitten metal. Rory moved to the iron pot suspended over the coals. She stirred the stew, twice the wooden spoon scraping the bottom with deliberate slowness. Steam rose, carrying the scent of venison wild onion and the last of the dried sage she had gathered before the first hard freeze. She ladled 2 bowls, set them on the scarred pine table, then took her own place at the far end. The rifle lay across her knees now, barrel pointed toward the floor, but within easy reach. "Eat while it's hot," she said. Tate nodded once. He sat movements measured, as though testing the chair's strength. Rafe stayed standing a moment longer, eyes sweeping the room again, the rifle pegged above the mantel, the narrow window shuttered tight, the small shelf, where a few books leaned against a tin of coffee. His gaze paused on the thin silver chain around Rory's neck, the small locket half hidden beneath her shirt collar. Cole's. She had not taken it off since the day she buried him. Rafe finally sat, bowl untouched. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moaned low against the logs, a sound like breath caught in the throat. No one spoke for a long time. Rory ate slowly, tasting nothing. She watched them without staring, how Tate lifted the spoon with care, how the scar that ran from his collarbone disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt, shifted when he swallowed. Old wound, deep, the kind that pulls when the weather turns. Rafe's fingers never left the knife hilt. The storm grew louder, battering the shutters until the cabin seemed to shrink around them. No leaving tonight. No one coming up the trail. The canyon was theirs alone now. 3 strangers bound by weather and necessity. Tate set his bowl down, half empty. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then looked at the fire for a long moment. "Our village stood where the red rock opens to water," he said at last. Voice low without inflection. Men came at night with torches and rifles. We fought. Fire moves faster than arrows. By morning, the houses were ash. Some of us went north. Some were taken to the wire places. The rest drifted. He did not look at Rory as he spoke. He did not need to. The words carried their own weight. Rory's spoon paused above her bowl. She stared into the broth, seeing instead the frozen ground 2 winters back, the way Cole's coat had frozen stiff while she dug. No preacher, no marker, just earth and silence. "They shot him over a line on a map," she said quietly. "Found him 2 days later under a boulder. No one asked questions. I buried him myself." The words came out flat, used up. She had not spoken them aloud in years. Tate lifted his eyes to hers across the table. For the first time since they crossed the threshold, something passed between them, not pity, not promise, only recognition. Two people who had watched fire take what could not be replaced. Rafe shifted. His chair scraped the floorboards. He spoke without looking up. "Hope is weakness. It gets people killed." The words hung in the smoke-thick air. Tate's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Rory felt the heat rise in her face. Not anger exactly, but the old sting of being reminded how thin the line was between living and merely enduring. She rose, gathered the bowls, carried them to the wash basin. Water sloshed cold against the tin. She scrubbed harder than necessary, knuckles whitening. Behind her the fire hissed as Tate added another log. Rafe remained seated watching the door, as though expecting it to burst inward at any moment. Rory dried her hands on a flour sack towel, then turned back to the room. The pendant at her throat felt heavier than bone. She crossed to the corner shelf, took down 2 wool blankets, shook them out. Dust drifted in the firelight. "Floor's hard," she said. "Take these." Tate accepted his without comment. Rafe hesitated, then took the second blanket, folding it beside him rather than spreading it out. He did not thank her. Rory moved to the rocking chair near the hearth, pulled her shawl tighter, and sat. The rifle rested against the arm, now stock warm from the fire. Outside, the storm howled on, sealing every trail, every escape. Inside, the silence returned thicker, more dangerous than before. Tate settled against the walleyes on the flames. Rafe kept his back to the log's knife hand ready. Rory rocked once, slowly. The chair creaked like old bones. She looked at the 2 men across the wavering light, at the way the fire carved shadows under their eyes, at the way neither of them relaxed, even now. And she understood with a clarity that tasted like ash that the canyon had not simply allowed them here, it had demanded them. The night stretched ahead, long and unyielding, and whatever ghosts had followed any of them through the snow were already in the room, waiting for someone to speak their names again. The storm had spent itself by first light. Snow lay thick and quiet across the canyon floor, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears until you doubt your own hearing. Rory stepped out onto the porch, breath fogging white, the cold biting through wool and leather alike. She carried the post-hole digger over one shoulder, the iron head dark with old rust. The fence line needed mending, posts cracked by frost heave rails sagging like tired shoulders. Work waited same as always. She walked the length of the split-rail fence boots, sinking to the ankle. At the broken post she knelt, drove the digger down, felt the frozen earth resist. The metal rang against stone buried deep. She worked without pause, muscles remembering the rhythm, mind empty, except for the next strike. Tate appeared without sound. He carried the double-bit axe from beside the woodpile edge, gleaming where he had honed it earlier. He stopped a respectful distance away, waited until she glanced up. She nodded once. He set to splitting the rounds she had stacked the day before. Each swing was deliberate, the blade biting clean wood, parting with a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. He did not speak. He did not need to. The work was thanks enough. Rafe had climbed the low ridge behind the cabin. He stood motionless against the pale sky bow slung across his back, eyes sweeping the trail below and the far rim. Every few minutes he shifted position, never settling long in one spot. His shadow moved like a hawk's. Rory paused to wipe sweat from her brow despite the chill. She watched Tate work. His hands were steady, scarred across the knuckles, calloused in the way of a man who had held more than axes. When he finished the last round, He gathered the splits, carried them to the porch, without asking, stacked them neat beside the door. Then he took a small piece of bone from his pouch, dear, smooth and pale, and sat on the chopping block. He drew his knife, the blade thin and worn to a whisper. With slow, careful strokes, he began to shape the bone. Rory watched from the fence line. The form emerging was simple, a circle with rays lifting from one side. Rising sun. She had seen similar carvings once years ago, traded at the post, tokens of strength, of renewal, carried by women who had walked through fire and come out the other side. White-painted woman, the stories called her. Rory did not know the full meaning. She only knew the carving held weight. Tate's eyes stayed on his work. He did not look up when Rafe descended the ridge and approached. The younger man spoke low in their own tongue. Words Rory caught only fragments of, sharp, clipped urgent. She knew enough border Spanish and overheard phrases to guess the rest. Outsider. Shelter too long. Taboo. Alliance forbidden. Tate's knife paused. A thin curl of bone fell to the snow. He answered quietly without raising his voice. Rafe's jaw tightened. He turned away, walked to the far side of the barn, and nocked an arrow. He drew and released in one motion. The shaft hissed through the air, buried itself in a dead pine 20 yards off with a dull thunk. A warning shot. Or a test. Rory could not tell. She drove the last nail into the repaired rail, the hammer blow ringing too loud in the stillness. Her hands felt cold now, not from the air. She glanced at Tate. He had resumed carving, but the rhythm was slower, more deliberate, as though each stroke cost something. Rafe returned to the ridge. His silhouette against the sky looked smaller than before. Rory walked back toward the cabin, passing Tate without a word. She smelled the faint smoke on his cloak, the earth caught in the fringes, the sweat of hard travel still lingering under the frost. She stopped at the porch steps, looked down at the fresh split wood he had stacked. The pendant at her throat shifted when she breathed Cole's chain cool against her skin. She touched it once, fingers lingering, then let her hand fall. Tate looked up then. Their eyes met across the yard. No words. Only the recognition that had begun last night in the firelight, deeper, now more dangerous. She felt it settle in her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. A low rumble carried on the wind, not thunder, but hooves. Distant yet. Steady. Coming up the trail from the south. Rafe heard it first. He dropped to one knee on the ridge hand, shading his eyes. Tate rose slowly, knife still in his fistbone pendant, unfinished in the other palm. Rory turned towards the sound. The ridgeline was empty, except for the snow-dusted pines. But the hoofbeats grew clearer, 4, maybe 5 horses moving deliberate, not running, not fleeing. Men who knew where they were going. Tate stepped closer to the porch. His voice came low, almost lost in the wind. We must leave. But this ground has chosen to hold us. Rory met his gaze again. The words hung between them, heavy as the axe head still warm from use. She did not answer. The hoofbeats drew nearer, echoing off the canyon walls like a warning no one had spoken aloud. Rafe slid an arrow from his quiver and fitted it to the string. The morning light sharpened, cold and merciless, and the canyon waited. The afternoon light slanted low through the shutters, turning the cabin's interior the color of old brass. Snow had begun to melt along the eaves, dripping in slow, steady plinks against the tin roof, each drop a small reminder that the storm's grip was loosening. Inside, the air held the smell of damp wool drying by the fire pine smoke, and the faint iron tang of old blood that never quite leaves a place where men have bled. Tate sat on the low stool, near the hearth knees, apart the piece of bone balanced on his thigh. The knife moved in short, controlled strokes, shaving curls that fell like pale feathers to the dirt floor. The rising sun took shape slowly, a disk with rays lifting unevenly rough at the edges, but deliberate. Rory sat in the rocking chair a few feet away, hands folded in her lap, watching without moving. The chair did not rock. She had not spoken since the morning's work. Rafe stood at the open door, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed. His eyes were on the yard, the ridge, the trail that wound down into shadow. He had not sat since the hoofbeats faded earlier. Every so often his head tilted, listening for what the wind might carry next. Tate's knife paused. He turned the bone in his fingers, studying the light on its surface. His face showed nothing but the muscles along his jaw worked once, twice. Rory saw it, the flicker of something held back. She felt it in her own chest, a pull toward him that felt like trespass. The locket at her throat warmed against her skin, heavy with Cole's memory. Touching the dead's things carried its own rules in some places. She had never asked what those rules were for people like Tate. She only knew the weight had grown since he entered the cabin. Rafe spoke then, low and sharp in their tongue. The words came quick-edged. Rory caught outsider, and something about ghosts chindi the restless dead that follow the living if not properly sent on. She did not understand the rest, but the tone needed no translation. Rafe's eyes flicked toward her for the first time since morning brief and cold. Tate answered without looking up. His voice stayed even, almost soft. Rafe's shoulders stiffened. He pushed off the doorframe, turned his back, and walked a few paces into the yard. He did not return. Tate resumed carving. The knife scraped slower, now each stroke measured as though the bone might break if pressed too hard. Rory watched the shavings accumulate at his feet. She wanted to speak, to ask what the carving meant, but the words stuck. Instead, she rose, crossed to the small shelf, took down the tin of coffee grounds, and set water to boil. The kettle hissed. She kept her movements quiet, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet in the room. When she turned back, Tate had stopped. The pendant lay finished in his palm, simple strong, the rays catching the firelight like embers. He looked at it a long moment, then at her. No smile, no offering, just the steady weight of his gaze. She felt the fear then, small and cold, curling under her ribs. Not fear of him. Fear of what staying near him might mean, of opening a door she had nailed shut after Cole, of letting another living thing close enough to leave its mark when it left. She touched the locket again, fingers pressing the metal until it hurt. Outside, Rafe's boots crunched on the softening snow. He had not gone far. A distant crack split the air, not thunder but gunfire. Sharp, single, then silence. Rory's head came up. Tate rose without haste, slipping the pendant into his pouch. He stepped to the door, looked out. Rafe was already on the ridge again, bow in hand, arrow nocked, but not drawn. The shot had come from down canyon. Too far to see smoke, but close enough to carry warning. Tate turned back to Rory. His voice was low, careful, as though the words themselves carried risk. This ground does not let us stay, but the ghosts do not let us go. He did not wait for her answer. He walked past her to the hearth, picked up the last log from the stack he had split that morning, and laid it on the coals. The fire flared, throwing sudden heat across her face. Rory stood where she was, the kettle beginning to steam behind her. She listened to the canyon, the drip from the eaves, the low moan of wind, returning the faint echo of that single shot, lingering like a promise. Rafe remained on the ridge, motionless, now watching the trail below. The light outside thickened toward dusk. Inside the cabin, the silence grew heavier. Still thick with what had been said, what had not. and what the next sound from down canyon might force them all to face. The morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that makes every shadow sharper than it should be. Rory rose before the sun cleared the rim rock, the cabin still dark, except for the faint red glow of last night's coals. She moved quietly, pulling on her coat, the wool stiff with cold. Ash stood in the small corral behind the barn, ears flicking, breath steaming in slow clouds. The mule had not eaten much since the storm. The hay was running low. Rory led Ash out on a short rope, the lead line rough against her palm. She carried 2 empty wooden buckets handles, worn smooth by years of use. The trail to the spring was narrow, winding down a shallow draw where the snow had melted into muddy patches. Tate and Rafe followed without being asked. Tate walked a step behind her moccasins, silent on the wet ground. Rafe kept to the high side of the trail bow in hand eyes, sweeping the slopes above and below. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft clop of Ash's hooves, the drip of meltwater from overhanging branches, and the occasional creak of leather as Rafe shifted his quiver. The spring lay in a small basin ringed by willows, the water usually clear and cold enough to ache the teeth. Rory knelt at the edge, dipped the first bucket. The surface rippled, then stilled. She frowned. A thin film of silt floated near the bank, fresh-turned earth, dark and wet. Boot prints pressed deep into the mud along the waterline-wide heel settler style. Someone had dug here not long ago. A shallow pit scarred the opposite bank roots, torn stones scattered. The water still ran, but slower, clouded. Tate stepped forward. He crouched beside the pit fingers, brushing the disturbed soil. His face did not change, but Rory saw the way his shoulders tightened, the way his breath caught for half a second. He traced the edge of the hole, then looked downstream where the runoff would carry the silt. His hand lingered on the ground, as though feeling for a pulse that had already weakened. Rafe moved to the nearest willow. A knife had carved deep into the bark, not random but deliberate. The words were crude English. "This ground ain't yours no more. Come back and we'll finish it." Fresh sap still bled from the letters. Rafe's fingers hovered over the carving without touching it. He turned his head, eyes meeting Tate's for a long moment. No words passed between them. Rory filled the second bucket, the water heavier than it should have been. She straightened buckets, pulling at her shoulders. Ash snorted, ears pinned back, nostrils wide. The mule smelled something wrong. Tate rose slowly. He walked a few paces along the bank, studying the ground. Trap sign, fresh-cut saplings bent into snares set too close to the water. Not for rabbits, for larger game, for anything that came to drink. The baits were gone, but the scent of fresh-cut pine lingered sharp and wrong. Rory set the buckets down. Her hands were cold knuckles, white around the rope. She looked at Tate. He did not meet her eyes at first. When he did, the pain was there, quiet, deep, the same look he had worn when he spoke of the burned village. Land touched wrong, carried its own sickness. She had seen it in the way settlers left their mark fences across trails poisoned, springs, trees girdled and left to die slow. She had never thought of it as sacrilege until now. Rafe stepped closer to Tate, voice low, urgent again in their language. Rory caught the edge of it, bandwater move now. Tate listened without answering. His hand pressed once against his side where the old scar pulled under his shirt. The movement was small, almost hidden, but Rory saw the wince he tried to swallow. She picked up the buckets. Water sloshed against the wood-cold drops, hitting her boots. She started back up the trail, Ash following close. Tate and Rafe fell in behind her. The silence between them was thicker now, heavier with what the spring had shown. Back at the cabin, Rory poured the clouded water into the barrel by the door. It would have to do until the silt settled. She knew it would not last the winter, if more came. The barrels were half empty already. The spring had been her last sure thing. Tate stood at the porch edge looking down the canyon. Rafe remained on the high ground scanning. A shout carried up from below, harsh male echoing off the walls. 4 riders appeared on the lower ridge, dark shapes against the snow. Vance Crow sat foremost, horse sidling under him. He cupped his hands and called again, voice flat and carrying. "Ghost woman, time to quit hiding. That land's got my name on it now. Come out peaceful or we come in hard." Rafe's bow came up arrow-nocked in one smooth motion. Tate stepped in front of Rory without hurry, placing himself between her and the riders below. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, not drawn but ready. Rory felt the old rifle in her hands before she realized she had reached for it. The stock was cold familiar. She did not raise it yet. The riders waited. Horses stamped. Metal clinked, rifles shifted in scabbards. Tate did not turn. His voice came low for her alone. "To guard this place now is to stand against our own law." He did not move. Neither did she. Below, Vance laughed, once short and mean. The sound rolled up the draw and died against the canyon walls. The morning held its breath again, waiting for the first move that could not be taken back. The riders came up the draw in a slow, deliberate line, horses blowing steam hooves, churning the half-melt snow into dark mud. Vance Crow rode point coat open rifle balanced across his saddle pommel. 3 others flanked him, faces shadowed under hat brims, hands already near weapons. The 4th hung back, leading a spare horse, loaded with packs, ready for what they meant to take. Rory stood on the porch rifle in both hands, now barrel low, but finger off the trigger. Tate remained in front of her feet, planted wide knife drawn, but held at his side. Rafe had moved to the corner of the cabin, arrow-nocked bow, half-drawn body, angled to cover the approach, without exposing himself fully. Vance reined up 30 yards out. His horse sidled, iron shoes scraping stone. He spat into the snow. "Ghost woman and her wild dogs," he called, voice carrying flat across the yard. "This land's spoken for. Step aside, peaceful, or we burn it down around you." No one answered. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet pine and horse sweat, and the faint, acrid bite of gun oil. One of Vance's men, heavy man Redbeard, swung down and walked toward the barn. He carried a torch, already lit flame guttering in the cold air. He kicked the barn door open, straw inside, catching the light. The torch arced in, landed on the dry bedding. Flames licked up fast, crackling smoke boiling out in black coils. Ash brayed once sharp and panicked from inside the corral. Rafe loosed first. The arrow hissed, struck the torchbearer high in the shoulder. The man grunted, staggered, dropped to one knee, clutching the shaft. Blood bloomed dark through his coat. He did not scream, only cursed low and tried to rise. Vance cursed louder, swung his rifle up. The shot cracked, splintering the porch rail beside Rory's leg. Wood chips stung her cheek. She dropped to one knee, shouldered the rifle, aimed high, and fired. The heavy report rolled down the canyon. The bullet clipped Vance's hat brim, spinning it off. His horse reared, nearly unseating him. Tate moved then, not a charge, but a steady forward step knife, low. He closed on the nearest rider before the man could clear leather. Tate's free hand caught the bridle, yanked the horse's head down. The rider swung a fist. Tate took it on the shoulder, then drove upward with the knife hilt striking under the ribs. The man folded, slid from the saddle, hit the snow hard. Tate stepped over him without looking back. Another shot, wild this time, grazed Tate's side. He staggered once, blood blooming dark through his shirt, but did not fall. He turned towards the shooter, eyes steady, and lunged again. The man fired once more, missed. Tate closed the distance, wrenched the rifle away, drove the butt into the man's jaw. Bone cracked. The rider dropped limp. Rory worked the lever chambered another round. She fired again into the ground near Vance's horse. The animal bolted sideways, Vance clinging to the horn. He wheeled, face twisted. "This ain't over, woman. I'll come back with more enough to bury all three of you." He spurred hard, the others dragging their wounded. Hooves thundered down the trail, fading into the canyon echo. Smoke poured from the barn, now thick and black. Ash screamed again, kicking at the corral rails. Rory ran toward the fire, but Tate caught her arm firm, not rough. He shook his head once. The barn was lost. The flames had already caught the roof beams. Tate released her. He pressed a hand to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and steady, soaking the leather of his belt. He swayed once, caught himself against the porch post. Rafe lowered his bow. He walked over slowly, eyes on Tate's wound, then on the burning barn, then on Rory. His face showed nothing but the set of his jaw was tighter than before. He had seen it all, Tate fighting not for band, not for land alone, but for this woman, this outsider. The act hung between them like smoke that would not clear. Tate looked down at the blood on his palm, then at Rory. His breath came shallow, each one costing more. "Now," he said quietly, "we have lost the way back." Rafe turned his face away. He walked to where the arrow had struck the first man, pulled it free. With a wet sound, wiped the blood on the snow. He did not look at Tate again. He only stood there, shaft in hand, watching the barn burn, watching the fire take what could never be replaced. Rory knelt beside Tate. She tore a strip from her shawl, pressed it against the wound. The cloth soaked through almost at once. Tate did not flinch. He only looked at her eyes, steady despite the pain. The barn roof gave with a groan, sparks lifting into the gray sky. Ash broke through the corral gate, at last trotted free, sides heaving. Smoke drifted across the yard, thick and bitter. No one moved to put out the fire. The canyon held the silence that followed, heavy with what had been done, what could not be undone, and what the next dawn would demand they face. The fire had burned low coals glowing dull red under a thin gray ash. Night pressed against the cabin walls, the wind gone quiet after the day's violence, leaving only the occasional pop of sap in the logs and the slow drip of meltwater from the eaves. Smoke lingered inside, thick and bitter, mixing with the sharp herbal scent of the poultice Rory had made, sage and yarrow crushed with what little clean water remained in the barrel. She knelt beside Tate, where he lay on the blankets near the hearth shirt, torn open at the side, the wound a ragged line across his ribs. Blood had darkened the cloth she pressed there, but the flow had slowed to a seep. She worked without hurry, fingers steady though her hands still carried the tremor of the afternoon. The poultice went on cold, the herbs sticking to the raw flesh. Tate did not flinch. His breathing stayed even shallow, but controlled eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, as though reading something written there long ago. Rafe sat across the room, back to the wall, knees drawn up, arms folded. He had not spoken since the riders fled. His bow rested beside him, quiver empty of the arrows he had spent. His gaze moved between Tate's wound, the blood-stiffened bandage, and Rory's hands. He watched her the way a man watches a stranger handle something sacred. Tate shifted once, a small movement that pulled a hiss of breath through his teeth. He reached into the pouch at his belt, drew out the bone pendant. It lay unfinished in his palm. The rising sun half-formed one ray, still rough, uncarved. He turned it slowly in the firelight. His thumb traced the edge, then paused. He spoke then so low the words barely carried past the coals. "White-painted woman walked through fire," he said. "She carried the name of the people forward. My mother's father carried it too. He spoke it when the village burned. He spoke it when I left the last camp. The name came soft, almost a breath, something in Apache old heavy with meaning Rory could not grasp." Tate's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, they held no plea, only the weight of what had been said. Rafe stirred. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low and flat. "The band will know. The ancestors do not forgive a man who lets ghosts follow at his heels." He did not look at Rory when he said it. He did not need to. The words landed like stones in still water. Tate did not answer at once. He lifted the knife from beside him, the blade catching the red glow. He set the pendant on his chest, drew one slow, careful stroke. A thin curl of bone fell away. The ray sharpened. He worked without pause, each motion measured as though the act itself were part of the naming he had begun. Rory watched the knife move. She felt the cabin shrink around them, the walls closer, the air thicker with smoke, and the copper smell of blood. The place no longer felt like hers alone, felt like the ground outside carried their footprints, now their blood, the scorch of the barn. What had been sanctuary had become marked desecrated in ways she could not mend. Tate finished the last ray. The pendant lay complete, simple, strong, the sun rising clean from the bone. He held it up once, studying it in the dim light, then lowered his hand. He turned his head toward Rory. She met his eyes. The fear was there, still quiet, deep, but something else moved beneath it, acceptance heavy as stone. Tate extended his hand. The pendant rested in his palm, warm from his skin. "Home is no longer lost," he said, "but my home belongs elsewhere now." He placed it in her hand. The bone felt light, almost fragile, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Rory closed her fingers around it. The chain of Cole's locket pressed against her wrist. 2 tokens. Now 2 ghosts, 2 promises she had not asked for. Rafe rose without sound. He crossed to the door, opened it a crack. Cold air slipped in, carrying the smell of wet ash from the ruined barn. He looked out into the dark, then back at Tate. "We leave before first light," he said. "No question, no argument." Tate nodded once. Rafe stepped outside, boots crunching the snow crust as he moved toward the horses. Inside, the fire settled lower. Coals pulsed once, twice, then dimmed. Rory remained kneeling beside Tate. She did not speak. She only looked at the pendant in her palm, feeling the faint warmth it still held. Tate closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, steady again. Outside, Rafe's silhouette moved against the stars, preparing waiting. The night deepened. The canyon lay silent, holding its breath once more. And in the quiet between heartbeats, Rory understood if she did not follow when they left, whatever had begun here would end in ash and silence, the same way everything else had. The coals glowed one last time, then faded to gray. Dawn was coming. The first light came thin and cold, spilling over the eastern rim like spilled milk. Rory stood on the porch one last time, the cabin behind her already a stranger's place. Smoke still clung to the air from the ruined barn, faint and sour. She carried only what she could bear, a blanket-rolled jerky wrapped in oilcloth, the last of the coffee grounds, a tin cup, and the rifle slung across her back. In her fist, she held the bone pendant, its edges pressing into her palm like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Ash waited in the corral, saddled and patient ears flicking at the wind. Rory led the mule out, rope loose in her hand. She did not look back when she closed the gate. The trail north followed the river narrow at first, then widening where the canyon opened. Tate's words echoed in her head, quiet, as breath followed the river north, where the red rock meets the pines. The first day, the snow still held in patches, crunching under Ash's hooves. By noon, it turned to slush, sucking at the mule's legs. Rory walked more than she rode boots heavy with mud breath, fogging white. The pendant hung now on a rawhide thong around her neck beside Cole's locket. 2 weights. 2 ghosts. She touched them both without thinking, fingers numb from the cold. The second day, the wind rose sharp and steady, carrying grit that stung her eyes. She camped in a shallow cut bank. No fire, only a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Ash stood close, head low, breath warm against her arm. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of distant coyotes and the memory of Tate's blood on the snow. On the third day, the river narrowed, forcing her higher along rocky ledges. Ash slipped once, foreleg buckling on loose shale. Rory caught the lead rope, steadied him, felt the tremble in the mule's shoulder. A shallow cut opened on the leg, nothing deep but enough to slow them. She bound it with a strip torn from her spare shirt, the cloth already stiff with mud. Ash limped after that, head down, trusting. She left the books behind on the 4th morning, 3 worn volumes from her father's shelf, wrapped in oilcloth. They had been the last pieces of the cabin she carried in her mind. She set them on a flat stone beside the trail, covered them with a rock to keep the wind from scattering the pages. The gesture felt like burying something small and final. She did not look back. The 5th day broke, clear the air, thin and biting. The river bent west, and the red rock rose sharp against the sky, tall cliffs streaked with iron rust pines clinging dark and stubborn to the upper slopes. Rory's legs ached deep in the bone, her breath short from the climb. Ash moved slower now, favoring the injured leg, but still followed. She crested a low rise and saw it, a small clearing tucked between stone walls, smoke curling thin from a low fire. 2 horses grazed nearby, tethered short. Rafe sat on a flat boulder, sharpening an arrowhead with steady strokes of flint. He looked up first. His hand froze mid-motion. The arrowhead dropped to the ground with a faint clink. Rory stopped. Ash halted behind her ears forward. Rafe rose slowly, bow already in his other hand. He knocked an arrow without hurry, drew halfway, held. His eyes never left her face. Tate stepped from the shadow of the pines. He moved stiff, the bandage at his side, dark with old blood. He stopped a pace from Rafe, hand raised, not to stop the bow, but to steady the moment. For a long breath, no one moved. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of resin and smoke and the faint iron of the river below. Rory let the lead rope fall slack. She took one step forward, then another. The pendant shifted against her chest. Tate's eyes met hers. Something flickered there, quiet joy shadowed heavy by what it cost. He spoke low, the words carrying just far enough. You followed. Rafe lowered the bow an inch. The arrow remained nocked. Tate took a single step toward her. His hand lifted, palm open, then fell again. He looked at the pendant at her throat, then back to her face. But now he said, everything has changed. The words hung in the cold air between them. Rafe turned half away, eyes on the horizon, arrow still in hand. He said nothing. Rory stood where she was, breath visible in short clouds. The clearing felt smaller than it looked, the cliffs pressing close, the pines watching. Tate did not move closer. The fire crackled, once low and small. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of hooves, faint far off, but coming. Rafe's head turned toward the sound. Tate's jaw tightened. Rory felt the weight of the pendant, the ache in her legs, the ghosts she had carried all this way. She did not speak. The sound of hooves grew clearer, steady, inevitable. The clearing waited silent and unforgiving for whatever came next. The fire in the small camp had burned down to a nest of coals, low and sullen, throwing faint orange light across the red rock walls. Night had settled heavy between the pines, the wind carrying the distant yip of coyotes, short, sharp calls that rose and fell like questions. No one answered. Rory stood near the center of the clearing, boots planted in the thin dirt, the pendant warm against her chest from the day's ride. Ash grazed a few paces off, head low, the limp in his foreleg, barely noticeable now, but still there. Tate faced her close enough that she could smell the faint smoke on his cloak, the clean earth caught in the fringes, the faint copper of his wound beneath fresh bandage. Rafe had moved to the edge of the firelight, back-turned halfway, arms folded bow, propped against a boulder. He watched without watching, witness silent the way the land itself watched. No one spoke at first. The coals popped once, sending a small spark upward into the dark. Rory lifted her hand, slowly palm open. Tate mirrored the motion. Their fingers met rough skin against rough skin, calluses from axes and reins, and years of holding on. The touch was brief, steady, not grasping, just enough to feel the pulse beneath. She felt it then, the quiet victory of having found him, of crossing the miles that should have kept them apart. But the weight came with it, the knowledge that this clearing, these rocks, these pines did not belong to her. The band's traces were everywhere, the low brush shelter, the medicine bundle tied to a branch, the careful spacing of the fire, so the smoke rose straight and thin. Outsider. The word Rafe had used days ago still hung unspoken between them. Tate's hand lingered a moment longer, then fell away. He looked past her shoulder toward Rafe. The younger man had not moved, but his posture had tightened, shoulders set like stone. Rafe spoke without turning. His voice came low, almost lost in the wind. "The band is moving. If you bring her, the sacred ground will turn from us." The words landed flat, without anger. Only fact. Tate's jaw worked once. He did not answer. He only looked at Rory again, eyes steady in the dim light. Rory felt the cabin behind her eyes, not the logs and roof, but the ground she had walked for years now, scarred by blood and fire, by the ghosts she had carried and the new ones she had invited. She could not return there, not whole. The place held too much now, Cole's unmarked grave, Hank's empty chair, the scorch where the barn had stood. It was no longer home. It was memory turned to ash. Tate's fingers brushed the bandage at his side. The wound had closed some, but the scar would stay thick, raised a line that pulled when he breathed deep. He would carry it, always reminder of the choice made in the canyon yard. Rafe stepped closer to the horses. He began to check the cinch's movements, deliberate, unhurried. The leather creaked under his hands. He did not look at them. He only worked, bearing silent witness to what was ending. Tate lifted his hand again. This time he touched the pendant at Rory's throat, fingertips resting light on the bone, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath. His thumb traced one ray of the rising sun. "White-painted woman gave us renewal," he said quietly. But renewal is not peace. The words carried no promise, no comfort, only truth. He let his hand fall. Rafe finished with the first horse, moved to the second. The animals shifted, sensing the change in the air. Rory stood between them, the fire dying at her feet, the wind cold against her face. She looked at Tate, saw the lines etched deeper around his eyes, the steady calm that hid the cost. She looked at Rafe, saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept his back to her, guarding what remained of the band's path. No one moved to embrace. No one spoke of staying. The coyotes called again, closer now, their voices threading through the pines like thread through a needle. Tate turned toward the horses. Rafe already had the lead ropes in hand. Rory remained where she was, boots rooted in the dirt. The pendant rested heavy against her chest, renewal carved in bone, but not yet worn smooth by time. The coals flared once more, then settled to gray ash. Tate glanced back at her. One look, long, quiet, final. Rafe swung up into the saddle without a word. Tate followed slower, careful of the wound. They did not ask her to come. They did not ask her to stay. The horses moved off hooves, soft on the needle-strewn ground, shadows lengthening as they passed between the rocks. Rory watched them go. The wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. She stood alone in the clearing, the fire dead now, the night pressing close. The choice had come. It had not spoken its name yet. But it was here, and it would not wait forever. The first gray light seeped between the red rock spires, turning the pines from black to deep green. The fire had gone to ash hours before, only a faint warmth still rising from the coals, like breath from a sleeping animal. Rory stood a few paces from the horses, boots rooted in the needle-strewn dirt, fingers closed tight around the bone pendant. Its edges pressed into her palm, the rising sun carved there, smooth now from the days against her skin. Tate stood beside his horse, one hand on the braided rein, the other resting light against the saddle horn. The bandage at his side showed fresh through the torn shirt, dark at the edges, but no longer bleeding. Rafe had already finished with the packs. Blankets rolled tight, quiver full again, lead ropes knotted. He mounted without hurry, horse shifting under him, breath steaming in the cold dawn air. No one spoke. The wind moved low through the trees, carrying the faint, far-off call of a coyote single. Drawn out, then gone. The sound lingered in the silence that followed, as though the land itself had noted their presence and was deciding what to remember. Tate turned toward Rory. Their eyes met across the small distance. The look held everything that had passed between them since the canyon storm, the shared firelight, the blood on snow, the weight of hands touching once and then again. No promise had been spoken, no vow broken aloud. Yet the air between them carried the knowledge that something had been made, and now it must be let go. Rafe kept his gaze forward toward the trail that wound north between the cliffs. His hands rested loose on the reins, but his shoulders held the rigid line of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He was witness, still eyes that would carry this morning forward when no one else could speak of it. Tate stepped closer to Rory. He lifted his hand slowly, palm open, then placed it on her shoulder, not gripping, only resting there. The touch was brief, steady, the warmth of his palm passing through wool to skin. He did not speak. There were no words left that would change the path. Rafe nudged his horse forward. The animal moved off at a walk, hooves soft on the pine needle's shadow stretching long across the red rock. Tate held Rory's gaze one moment longer. Then he turned, swung up into the saddle with careful motion, mindful of the wound. He settled the reins, glanced once at Rafe's back, then at Rory. The two horses moved away together side by side, figures growing smaller against the rising light. Dust lifted faint from their hooves, settled again almost at once. They passed between two tall spires, then around a bend where the trail dropped out of sight. Rory did not move. She stood in the center of the clearing, the wind cold against her face, stirring the ash at her feet. The pendant lay warm against her chest, its carved rays catching the first true sunlight that moved across the bone like slow fire. She felt the ghosts behind her Cole's unmarked grave Hank's empty chair, the scorched earth of the canyon yard. And now these new ones, the smoke from a dying fire, the scent of pine and horse and blood that would not fade. She did not cry out. She did not run after them. She only watched until the last shadow vanished behind the ridge. The wind rose again, carrying the faint smell of old smoke, of earth, turned by hooves of something finished. The clearing lay empty now except for her and Ash, who stood patient a few yards off, ears forward waiting. The sun climbed higher, sharp and merciless, lighting the red rock until it glowed like fresh blood. Rory drew one long, breath-tasting dust and pine, and the cold promise of another day alone. She turned toward Ash, took up the lead rope. The mule nuzzled her arm once warm and quiet. The trail south waded back toward the river, toward the canyon that no longer held a home. She started walking. The wind followed, carrying the last thin thread of smoke from the dead fire. It scattered across the rocks and was gone. The silence closed in behind her, complete and final. What remained was not peace. It was simply what was left after everything had been given its due. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.